Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this session. First, I always like to point out that I have the pleasant task of this evening of welcoming people. But before we start, I would like to thank Dr. Meagan Sylvester, who on short notice, from what I see, having been a part of this, said yes to us to come and share with us some of her work this evening. It's good to make your acquaintance, even if virtually. I was going to apologize, but that would be on behalf of COVID for making it impossible for us to get together in person and possibly break bread together. But, you know, someday. So welcome and thank you for agreeing to do this. I want to thank my colleague, Professor Carol Boyce-Davies, through whose contact this contact was originally made, and for facilitating, this contribution to our colloquium series, and to the organizing committee led ably by Professor Andrea C. Lumumba, with Dr. Richardson as a member and Dr. Tao Lee Goff as a member, for putting together another exciting and absolutely treasured program for us to be educated about a very important part of our discipline that we do not often talk about. And I want to thank them for that. And to Donna, who is the linchpin for all this, through whose good offices all these technical details are dealt with, and all this stuff is made to come together so that even in these circumstances, we can all get together to listen to this talk, have conversations about it, and I hope leave more enriched than we all came. And to all of you who have decided to share your time with us this afternoon, my hope is that you continue to feel like the time you spend with us is never a waste. And as long as that continues, we would always find it in us to put good intellectual food before you, and we hope that you'll always consider hanging out with us and sampling what we put in front of you. So without further ado, I will hand over to Professor C. Lumumba, who will be conducting this evening's session as the chair of the organizing committee. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Taiwo. I don't want to repeat for the sake of time because it goes always too fast. And we're eager to hear our host share with us the enlightening, really knowledge that she has agreed to share with us. So I would like to just thank again, Dana. Dana, you're always wonderful, always ready. So without you, collaboration, cooperation, it would have been difficult given the short notice. But the short notice impact is even more felt by our host, Professor Sylvester. Thank you so much for being so understanding, so flexible, despite your time that we know is very rigid, but you found some flexibility within. So we are most grateful. And of course, we would not have known without, as Professor Taiwo said, without our colleague, Professor Carol Boyce-Davies, letting us know this great opportunity. I want to just mention also that Professor Richardson was a member of the committee, Professor Tao Lee Goff, who's not here at the moment, but Professor Taiwo offered to fill in her shoes I don't know the size of each other's shoes, so I cannot say anything about it. But more seriously, what I want to add is that the Africana studies was conceptualized, created as a philosophical way of capturing our universe, global Africa. The idea that the Africa, the continent, cannot be understood, cannot be fully grasped without considering its people across the globe. Similarly, no matter how successful, no matter what happens to the branches, you cannot say I'm a very luxurious branch, therefore I don't need the roots anymore. So you imagine what happened in that case. So that it is really in our mutual benefit and for the world, actually, that we see the global Africa together dynamically, not only as a common past, but a common present and future. So the Caribbean is very much part of the Africana studies as a space of this global African world. And so we celebrate all of them. The founding of Africana, they were present. They have been present since then. And so it gives us a pleasure. We used to have a program of visiting scholars. So we had scholars from the Caribbean, from Latin America, and from the continent and other part of our global African world. So it's very dynamically, very much part of it. So I would like to invite Professor Carol Boyce Davis to introduce our speaker. And personally, I can't wait to hear you. Okay, Professor Boyce Davis.
Hi, and good evening. Cultural critic Stuart Hall says that Caribbean cultures and Caribbean cultural productions are re-elaborations of African cultural forms received and recreated in our own ways. And for Sylvia Winter, another cultural critic and theorist, this is how African peoples indigenized themselves in the Caribbean landscape. And in many ways, then, our festival cultures do just that. So today's talk, People Power Movements in Caribbean Festival Culture, is one of those which will hopefully add to the knowledge stream as far as these various processes, re-elaborations and indigenizations are concerned. So I am so pleased to present Dr. Meagan Sylvester, who actually, when I was president of CSA, functioned as the editor of the newsletter, and she still does that. So anytime you see the CSA newsletter, she's the person doing it. But even more significant, she ended up being made the spokesperson for the major organization of Calypsonians, TUCO, the Trinidad Unified Calypsonians Organization, as chair of the Education and Research Committee. In that capacity, she is the person who goes on television, around the country to schools and social media and so on, doing the kind of work that lets the young people in particular know what the history has been of Caribbean oral traditions. Definitely in one of her formations, it's from griot to Calypsonian. So how the African griot becomes the Calypsonian in the Caribbean is part of that mix. She's a published author of many journal articles and book chapters. She uses print media, television, social media platforms to engage these discussions and has published widely in areas of her research interests, and I'm listing them: Music and National Identity in Calypso and Soca, Music of Diasporic Carnivals, Narratives of Resistance in Calypso and Ragga Soca Music, Steelpan, kaisoJazz, Musical Identities, Gender and Identity in Calypso and Soca, Music and Human Rights in the Americas. So she has an amazing breadth and has given lectures, I know, in universities across the United States and in the Caribbean, in Europe, Latin America as well, and other countries in South America. She recently completed a PhD in the sociology of music at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, and is currently awaiting the awarding of that degree. So Meagan, it's a pleasure having you. She's also doing research, I should say, while she's in the US on the early encounters of Calypsonians with the music industry, the early versions of the Rum and Coca-Cola group and so on, Roaring Lion and those early guys. And that's what she's working on while she's in the US. So it's a pleasure having you, Meagan, and take it away. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Davies, and thank you very much for all of the other persons who would have taken the opportunity to introduce me and to say something about, the presentation that I'm about to make. And of course, thank you for this very warm welcome to Cornell University online. And so now I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to focus on the presentation. As indicated, people power. Yes. Is it being seen?
Not yet.
All right. Not sure what's happening. Yes. Yes?
Yes, now.
Right. Good. All right. So I'm going to be showing this slide that is dealing with people power movement in Caribbean festival culture. And it's important that we understand that what I'm going to be focusing on today, of course, is this paper intends to look at the ways in which carnival cultures have grappled with the issues of power, disempowerment, and empowerment during the pandemic. In many ways, COVID-19 has brought with it the cessation of power in several forms, such as movement, work, and travel. In many carnival cultures, however, the grueling effects of the pandemic has not been able to stymie the creative genius of cultural expression. Instead, the concept of power has been re-engineered to possess new meaning in festival spaces. And one such example is Trinidad and Tobago, the islands on which this paper will focus. Now to look at a little bit of background. COVID-19 has severely impacted global economies. The disruption and disempowerment of industry structures, which the pandemic has created, requires a reassessment of the issues of vulnerability and sustainability across sectors. Within the corporate sector, managers have had to reimagine and reemploy responsive strategies to treat with financial and contractual obligations to employees. This is according to Craven et al. 2020. Specifically, a business model rethink together with reactive and rather than proactive strategies for growth and stimulus have been the new normal. Further, to mitigate significant losses, several companies have had to reduce employee workload, institute work from home arrangements, establish cost-cutting mechanisms, and access financial assistance from government welfare safety nets. The reality of the international business community has then in many ways been mirrored in the international music industry. And so it's important for us to interrogate at this time what has really happened in Caribbean festival culture. And as I would have indicated earlier, we're really going to be looking at the case study of Trinidad and Tobago. But let's consider several segments of the international music industry. Recording. The recording and publishing sectors have noted the reassessment of priorities in consumer behavior towards music and music products and services. In fact, according to Mulligan 2020, with the closure of recording studios and delayed project release timelines, there have been disruptions to the recorded music supply chain. In looking at publishing, we note that music supervision has catapulted from a constant flow of income from TV, film, and advertising productions to an intermittent trickle of music-related briefs since the coronavirus appeared on the scene. We turn now to look at live music. While there has been a clear disruption by COVID-19 on the recorded music and published sectors, live music sector has experienced the highest interference and reduced power differentials. Cancellations and postponement of live music events inclusive of technology conferences, to major concerts, to small-scale individual performances, and festival band shows have been ubiquitous. And this is according to Billboard 2020. Added to this have been the horrors of ticket refunds and loss of down payments for venues and management services, which placed added pressure on major ticket distributors such as Ticketmaster. In response to the challenges, the company itself had to furlough 25% of its team as part of a broader plan to cut $500 million in expenses. But all is not lost. COVID-19 has brought about new opportunities for the creation of commerce, new fund sources, and alternative options for fan engagement and reach for artists. And this paper intends to highlight one such case study of radio, TV, and a streaming business in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, several Calypso and Soca artists in the Twin Island economy of Trinidad and Tobago took their performance power back during the 2021 Carnival season and appeared in several events online. Virtual music shows became the dominant form of festival culture as headliners took to the airwaves. Concerning itself with impact, identity, and socio-demographic correlates of how musicians and the music industry organized to provide musical content in a world plagued by the pandemic, this paper will seek to explore these intersections using a music sociological lens. As adjustments to COVID-19 emerged out of the new normal, Trinidad and Tobago's Calypso and Soca music space used technology to transform the direction and delivery of performances in the age of coronavirus and shift, indeed, the power differentials in the music industry. Methodologically speaking, and using a case study approach, looking specifically at the work of KMP Music Group CEO and Main Ideas creator, Kenny Phillips, and his menu of services within the KMP Music Group, inclusive of WAC Radio, WAC TV, KMP Music Lab, an audio company, a video company, and a video editing company, all backed by state-of-the-art streaming. So what exactly was the process? Having been heavily invested in the music culture of Trinidad and Tobago, Kenny Phillips has been able to attract a cadre of Calypsonians, soca artists, harang, chutney, and gospel artists as well to his studio to perform live, record, and be financially viable in these uncertain times. So I take you back now to March 2020, when we had the first announcement in Trinidad and Tobago about the presence of COVID-19. Following that, the government of Trinidad and Tobago, the Prime Minister, made a decision to have a national lockdown, which was inclusive of locking down the borders themselves. This was then followed by a post-carnival season of the need for carnival winners to perform their hits. Now, let me give you a little background to what would have happened. Trinidad and Tobago had the great fortune to actually be able to stage Carnival 2020, which was not an opportunity that presented itself to other carnival or festival spaces. And so as a result of that, there were many carnival winners, meaning persons who would have won the Calypso competition, persons who would have won the Soca Monarch competition. For example, WAC, a culture crazy radio station, enters the scenario and started to look for a way to generate funds based on the stay-at-home measures imposed as part of the response to COVID-19. On March 29, 2020, collaborating with fundmetnt.com platform, the CEO of WAC and his co-host, Mr. Desmond, live stream a competition, a DJ battle of sorts called Tune for Tune. This show was a huge success for a regular Sunday radio program, and the funds amassed approximately $11,000 TT. This is Trinidad and Tobago dollars. Following through on this new opportunity to make money during the COVID-19, soon WAC FM launched a series of live stream concerts on the platform. The format is a simple one. People see the show for free and pay what they can via the website FundMeTNT. Viewers could tune in via YouTube, Facebook, or the FundMeTNT.com app and enjoy shows featuring all local talent. As was indicated before, Trinidad had that opportunity to have winners coming out of the March Gras and the Carnival Tuesday activities. WAC 90.1 filled the gap for both performance opportunities and survival options in this post-Carnival season. To date, WAC has hosted over 170 shows on the website, raising over 1.5 million TT, providing a platform for nostalgia, as most of the patrons are North Americans residing in the diaspora. In addition, this initiative has expanded the opportunity for nationals of TNT to experience Calypso, Soca, Parang, Chutney Soca, and Steelpan culture in cyberspace. The third success factor has been to provide a steady stream of income for artists to maintain some semblance of career viability during the pandemic. Now let's look at the whole issue of people power and the movements. Prior to COVID-19, the Culture Crazy radio station was hard-pressed itself to even reach 8,000 subscribers. However, with the launch of the virtual shows, new figures revealed almost 60,000 persons. So we see power being reinstated to the radio station itself, as well as the audio company and the television station. According to Mr. Phillips, he says you have to spend money to make money. And the way that he saw it is that he almost amounted to 19,500 to 20,000 TT is what he would have put out, which covered space rental, the PA system, lighting, camera equipment, cameramen, bandwidth, advertising, radio broadcast, DJ, set design, and other sundry particulars. Now it becomes important to actually list out the different aspects that the money would have covered. And the reason for this is that it takes a lot to put on a show, even in cyberspace. And this is important to note as well. This amounted to a win-win arrangement between WAC and the performers themselves, where the station gets 50% of the profits and the other 50% redounds to the performer. Let's look at the Calypso successes, because indeed we are talking about this festival culture and we're focusing on Calypso music and that particular genre. In collaboration with the Trinidad Unified Calypsonians organization, TUCO, WAC FM launched the new Calypso 10 series, which featured a total of 7 shows. Shows would have come from the South Zone, Kaiso Caravan, from the Tuco East Zone, the Calypso Review, Classic Russo, and Kaiso House, the mother of all Calypso tents. Now, these tents I'm explaining about or telling you about are Calypso tents that prior to COVID would have been the space where patrons would have assembled to hear the year's new Calypsos. The brand new approach took the Calypso tent to the people in cyberspace, of course, and created the opportunity for the reemergence and the reinsertion of the Calypso art form into the psyche of the nation and nationals abroad. This was considered a win on all counts for Calypso. The ways in which carnival cultures have grappled with the issues of power, disempowerment, and empowerment during the pandemic are as follows. First, the existence of Trinidad and Tobago Carnival, which is the power to perform amidst a worldwide pandemic, because we recognize that even though it was only in March 2020 that it was announced that COVID-19 was impacting Trinidad and Tobago, there were other spaces in the world where COVID-19 had begun to have its impact. We looked to the whole issue of disempowerment, which was the total shutdown of TNT national borders, preventing carnival winners from seizing the power to make money and perform and further their careers in the post-carnival season. We then turned to an understanding of how empowerment emerged out of this opportunity. And this was the creation of performance and fund accumulation opportunities via the WAC online streaming platform. And now what I'm sharing with you are these visuals of the actual flyers that were used to advertise the shows. So one of the shows was called Up Close and Personal, and we see Calypsonian and Soca artist Designer, who would have been one of the main performers in this series. Then we would have focused here on Parang music, and I'm hoping to share with you some Parang music from Trinidad and Tobago later in this presentation. This is considered Christmas music. So we see that although this opportunity created itself in the post-carnival season, we also had Parang music, which is considered Christmas music from Trinidad and Tobago, being featured on this WAC online platform. Again, creating nostalgia for those abroad. Unfortunately, we would have lost Singing Sandra, one of our main female icons within the Calypso fraternity. The WAC platform was also used to have this celebratory activity for her, and we see photos here of other Calypsonians who would have been contributing to this activity. I spoke about earlier the Calypso tent online. This is an example of how this activity was rolled out. All of the persons who would have been regularly performing in the Calypso tent in the face-to-face sessions, they then came to the studio and performed online. And this was an example of the Calypso Review tent, which is an extremely popular tent in Trinidad and Tobago. During the time of COVID-19, we've had many other national disasters and indeed regional disasters. One such would have been the volcano eruption in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And again, this platform online at WAC FM was used to have a gospel benefit concert to raise funds through the online platform to send to our brothers and sisters in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. In addition to that, we also use the platform to have celebratory activity for living Calypsonians. And we see here celebrating contender who had had 55 years in Kaiso in 2021, and we would have had this kind of activity for him. We then look at Super Blue, one of our main icons, started off in the Calypso genre, and also returns to it often, but mainly sings in the soca genre, and we would have had this celebratory activity for him on the platform. And so I want to take this opportunity to just indicate to you that this was just a snippet of the kind of activities that we would have had coming out of this particular WAC FM online platform. I want to share some music with you, and I'm hoping that I'm able to, yes. So this is an example of Pan by Storm, a Calypsonian designer singing a song about our Steelpan music. Okay, and I also want to share with you another song by the same artist where we see another accompaniment of Steelpan music together with Calypso music. This would have been part of what the nationals abroad and those who reside in Trinidad and Tobago would have had the benefit of experiencing from a studio example.
Like a diamond in the night, shining bright. She's alright. Magical. Yes, her charm is so magical. She takes all my blues away any day. She's okay. just wanna hold her tight day and night. Calypso music feels so good.
So that is actually a love song to Calypso. And we see the kind of versatility that our artists have. And this is what we would have been focusing on WAC FM. So I was speaking to you earlier about Trini Christmas music, and I spoke about the band Los Tocadores. Here's an example of their music. Okay, and then we look at thank you. So this is actually the end of my presentation. So thank you very much for that.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much. It's enlightening, delightful, pleasant. So Dana, you want to make another announcement before we move to the question and answer?
I'm trying to get myself back on screen.
Okay.
Hold on 1 second. Well, I can just say it. I just want participants to be aware of the fact that this is being recorded. And if you don't want your face on camera, so that we can post this on YouTube, please just shut off your cameras. But if you would like to ask a question, please turn on your camera and ask your question. Or put your question in chat if you would prefer not to be seen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, Professor Riche Richardson, it's you who's going to manage the question and answer session.
Thank you so much, Professor Asia Lumumba, and thank you, Professor Sylvester, for such a rich and engaging talk. So the floor is open at this point for any questions that the audience may have.
Oh, maybe I can ask a question. So I'm wondering, in the Calypso tent live, there's a whole tradition of people shouting kaiso, kaiso, indicating if they like the music or like the song or the lyrics. And then ways of calling back the singer to come back and do another verse and do another verse. And then they will add more lines and so on and improvise sometimes. So now that it's gone online, how is that gone? Or we have to wait for that when the pandemic is over? Or there a version of that would happen live where you get the orality part of it that is being lost to the technology back in place?
Okay, so thank you very much for that question, Professor Davies. So yes, you are quite right. During the face-to-face or live performance, you have that interaction between the audience and the performer. What happens online in cyberspace is that, of course, this is set up where you have the opportunity to type in. So you use emojis actually, and you put 5 emojis, for example, you use the technology, or you actually can type in the word kaiso, meaning there is someone who is monitoring the chat, who then indicates to the performer, listen, people are calling for you to do an encore, which is actually this procedure where you call back the artist. So we have a replication actually of what happens in the face-to-face live test. So it's actually quite an exciting time because the performer is in front of a camera. They have no idea of the impact that they're having. They have no idea of what is happening behind the scenes. And because there is someone who's managing the process, It's really, a very exciting time. What are the persons saying about me? How can I then improve my performance? How many times do they want me to sing another line, etc.? So it's really a new and engaging way between the call and feedback response. Yes, so it really, really has changed the way in which we conceive the Calypso performance and the interaction between the audience and the performer.
Right. If I can follow up, and relatedly, it seems there was a lot of mini or smaller carnivals and performances in local spaces and backyards. Even one song singing about singing in the backyard.
Yes.
So do you think this is going to have an impact on later carnivals where people will feel no need to go all the way every time to one place, but that there could be multiple versions in different locations?
That is a very interesting question. Of course, this song that Professor Davies is referencing is Backyard Jam by our current Soca Monarch winner, Farmer Nappy. And this is an interesting song because it really encapsulated and captured an adjustment to COVID-19. What do we do if we can't go because the borders are locked down and we have stay-at-home measures? You create an atmosphere, a carnival-like, albeit a festival-like activity or an atmosphere in your own backyard. And this is what Trinidadians and Tobagonians were doing in response to that. We also know that this type of activity took place in other spaces in the diaspora, where nationals resided. And so you had mini carnivals being created in the backyards of people to reinvent and recreate again, looking at nostalgia and also thinking about how do we keep our culture alive. In terms of going forward, we think we're going to be having a hybrid approach to understanding festivals and festivities. That is, people, once the society opens up, there is going to definitely be a return to those larger spaces, but there's a new way now as we have reinvented how to capture our own identity and our own diasporic culture within our own homes and our own backyards. There's going to be a merging between larger event spaces and the smaller event spaces.
Okay.
I have a question for Dr. Sylvester, if I could interject one, and that is, this is Rashay Richardson, just a question about how you came to study this area, how you got into it originally, what drew you to your field of work, and why music is important for thinking about and engaging questions of identity.
Okay, thank you for that question. Okay, so strictly speaking, I am a sociologist, but I've also had this keen desire to be involved in music and musical activities. And so I decided to marry them. And there you have the whole concept of this music sociologist. Looking from a sociological standpoint, where we're concerned about issues of identity, issues of stratification, we're talking about race, class, color, etc. I really wanted to touch on and understand what takes place with the lyrics. In particular, I focus on the Calypso art form, but I also look at soca and kaisoJazz and Steelpan music. And as I showed in the videos, Calypsonians singing alongside Steelpan musicians. So for me, it became important to understand who crafts the lyric, what should we learn about the lyric, that is about the identity of Trinidadians and Tobagonians. What is it saying about us? What is it saying about our engagement with the rest of the Caribbean? Because there's been so many Calypsonians who've sung about issues taking place in terms of the development of CARICOM, that single market economy, talking about world issues, talking about activities taking place in the international space. And because I am a sociologist by training, and I have this wide berth for understanding these interconnections, I thought that it was applicable to add that musical element to it, to become involved in the pursuit of music sociology. Because we all know that a lyric is not just a lyric. It's saying something about who we are, it's saying something about our past, and it's saying something about where we're going. Now, I am, as Professor Davies would have mentioned earlier, I am on the board of the Trinidad and Tobago Unified Calypsonians organization. And this is an organization, an interest group created as part of a government initiative coming out of the Ministry of Culture to focus specifically on the Calypso art form in Trinidad and Tobago. And I am the Education and Research Director on that board, having remit for taking Calypso to schools, engaging primary school students, secondary school students, and also tertiary educational spaces, in addition to engaging the national public, going to the library and having public engagement sessions with the general public. And this becomes important because we want our own people to understand the music that emanates from within. Because as we look at and we interrogate, we can always look at dancehall music. We can always look at hip hop music. We could also look at other types of music coming out of the diaspora, music from the continent. But what we really want to do in addition to doing that is look at who are we? What is our music saying about us? The lyrics, as well as the beat, as well as the rhythms. And then we marry that with an understanding of the history. What are the African elements that come into the Calypso art form? And sometimes we see that merging taking place in terms of, let's say, we look at Afrobeat, look at Afropop, and we look at other types of connectivities in the music. And so it's all saying something about who we are as persons of color and as persons who are part of the diaspora. So this is all of these elements have added into my decision to marry my love for both sociology and for music.
Have a question?
I'd like to ask a question, if that's all right. Yes, thank you, Professor Sylvester. I'm just curious to know some of your general thoughts about Caribbean culture, the ethos of Caribbean cultural forms. And especially, I think in terms of in relation to national identity, right? And I think of other spaces, other nations, and the kinds of material artifacts, rituals, cultural forms that are repeated as part of national celebrations, right? You have the dynamic forms, but you also have sort of static forms. It seems I've been always curious about trying to find in the Caribbean static forms, and I can't find them. In the sense of, it always seems to be cultural forms that are explicitly dynamic. All cultural forms are dynamic, but these are explicitly, they make no apologies for going with the times, just like as you so beautifully demonstrated in your talk, right? And I wonder if you could comment on that. I mean, is this space that the Caribbean space, because of its history, in a way, one that refuses or resists the celebration of static, non-dynamic, processual forms of culture?
Thank you for that question. Interestingly, in my work, I've not only looked at Calypso and Soca, but I've also looked at chutney and chutney soca. And I would have mentioned that in my presentation as well. If we look at the dichotomy between the static and the dynamic, we have found that specifically if we look at Asian culture, looking at East Indian culture, and those cultural forms as represented in Trinidad and Tobago in particular, we see that we have two streams. We have chutney music, right, where we look at Indian authenticity in terms of the types of instruments that are used. They actually sing songs in Hindi, and that becomes important to understand that. And that is actually part of celebratory activity, weddings and funerals and other sort of celebrations. So you have that remaining intact, in addition to having celebrations like Diwali, which is present, and they try to retain as much as possible some of those retentive elements, from India, etc. But we also have that dynamism that you were mentioning in terms of that hybrid between chutney and soca music. And so that is a representation of where we see that merging. And that becomes, of course, the element of soca music as well as chutney music. Of course, some of the songs are sung in English. Some of the artists who actually perform in the authentic chutney art form, they actually sing these chutney soca songs in both Hindi and in English. And so that becomes a sort of treat for the audience. So that is one of the examples that we see where we see the continuation of some static elements and the introduction and continuation of dynamism. Not only do we see that with that Asian culture in terms of the East Indian dominance of that music, but we also see it in African forms. We would see that in terms of dance and music to accompany dance. So we have a group that's called the Laventil Rhythm Section, and they play rhythmic music, they use drums and percussive instruments, and we see that as an example of African retentive forms. We also see dance groups. We have dance groups that perform specifically African dance traditions. What they try to do, again, as far as is possible, and I'm talking here specifically about Trinidad, is to sort of replicate and continue parts of that retentive culture. If we look now, because I've been speaking all along about Trinidad and Tobago, but they're really two separate islands and they have different cultures. And you would see that there would have been more of the Welsh, the Irish, the French, and the Dutch who would have had a presence in Tobago as opposed to Trinidad, where you would have had that Spanish element being more dominant. And what you have happening in Tobago is you have music that actually, where they do the reel and the jig dance, and they sort of reenact Tobago festival activity like the Mariah wedding. And what you see happening there is that desire to retain some of those static elements, not only the music, but in the dance and other expressions in terms of the costuming, in terms of the adornment, in terms of the hair, etc. So there is that merge and that mixing between the static and the dynamic in some of the musical and cultural forms of both Tobago and Trinidad.
Thank you.
Riche, I have a question.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, I think you have spoken already of a dimension of my question as I was formulating it. It's the historical part and how Calypso traveled across the Caribbean. There are claims of where it originated, claims of where the name comes from, and so forth. So can you speak to that? And also, what instrument were part of it? How did the instrument, the part, evolve? Since the drum were not permitted in the beginning. So can you speak to those aspects? I have a few other questions, but this one first.
Okay. One of the important elements of the Calypso art form is this, issue about its origin. Of course, we understand in terms of what is Calypso. Calypso is a response to the atrocities that would have taken place on the plantations. What that actually says is that Calypso would have existed wherever there was plantation slavery, which means that could be the southern United States as well as the Caribbean. And that's important to note. So that's also part of what is in the literature. And, there's this toing and froing about its origin. When we look at the music in terms of the groups, it is understood that it could come from the African elements as well as the French elements, because of course we understand that Calypso is the music that accompanies the carnival festival and the festivities that take place there. And so what you have is two carnivals existing. Yeah, you have the pretty mass, where you have, what is considered this high class carnival, and then you have the lower class carnival, where you have other elements and other ways of self-expression. All right. And so those are some of the arguments as well in terms of the literature. In particular, Professor Liverpool, who is also Calypsonian Chalkdust, has spoken a lot about where Calypso come from. And there's this whole argument that what we have when we have these national conversations about the dominance of the Calypso art form. But what becomes important to note is Calypso has lived through the ages and has transferred and has been transplanted to several spaces. As Professor Boyce Davies mentioned earlier, I'm actually here in New York doing a project called Calypso, the New York Experience, where I'm actually doing a series of interviews with individuals who have actually, the Trinidadians or Tobagonians, and they would have been in the islands. They would have been born, they would have been raised, but then they migrated to New York. And they're sharing with me their stories about why they migrated and how they actually continued to perform and let people know about their culture in New York. Now, this actually has happened in several spaces around the globe. We know that we've had Calypso in Costa Rica, for example. We've had Calypso in Panama. So when, let's say, persons from the Caribbean region would have gone to the Panama Canal to help build the Panama Canal, when people migrate, they take their culture with them. So we find that we have the culture of carnival and the accompanying music Calypso residing in Canada. And we know about that carnival there, Notting Hill Carnival. We know that we have it in Miami. Most recently, we have it in DC. We have it, in several spaces. But we know that the tradition in particular, which is why I'm here doing this particular project in New York, is one of the spaces where you would have had a lot of persons from the Caribbean migrating. Some of them have come to perform, then they come back home to Trinidad, but in particular, some people have stayed. And in much in the same way as we look at the settler economies or the settler, colonies where we would have seen Britain, persons leaving there and coming, let's say, to Barbados and staying. When you migrate, you leave a significant, amount of your culture, where you're from and where you go to. And so this is what we're interrogating with this particular project. And this is a TUCO-based project as we try to get a sense of what happened on the ground in New York. But we do understand, of course, that there are several spaces. And I'm actually doing some work with another organization where we write about the different spaces in which Calypso resides, and we take it. So we get people on the ground who have been instrumental in forming and forging a Calypso space. So we're looking, I mentioned Costa Rica, we're focusing on Canada, we're looking at the London experience, because we know that, for example, Lord Kitchener would have, and others would have gone to London, and he spoke about during the Windrush years, and they would have spoken about and written about that experience there. So that is part of the work that I'm also doing with an organization. It's the International Journal of Carnival Arts, on which I am one of the board members on that, in that organization.
Okay. Well, as I said, I had other questions, but I will allow other people to also ask theirs, and then I'll come back.
I have a question.
Yes,
Much, Professor Sylvester, for your amazing presentation. I'm also Africana Studies. I'm a PhD student first year at Cornell. And you mentioned briefly this new approach to Calypso tent and this reimagining, this reemerging as an art form. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about like this engagement with the new normal in the old way. For example, I'm a musician, and I think about like the pandemic, prior to the pandemic, how there was many intimate spaces such as Facebook live streams, YouTube. Do you think those spaces have kind of constructed to like these larger carnival festivals?
Okay, thank you for that question. One of the things that I've noted, because there's a keen eye, we have a keen eye looking to see what's happening in cyberspace. How many persons are tuning in? How many persons are actually engaging with? Because persons can be there and not engaging, yeah. But just like you have, in your regular classroom. And one of the things that we're really looking at is to see how has this transformed the space in terms of understanding what's happening. And as I indicated in my presentation, what we have noted is that there are more persons who are now able to engage. Mm-hmm. What do I mean by that? In the face-to-face scenario, you would have had persons having to literally purchase a ticket to go and sit down at a live event. Invariably, these are night shows. They take place during the night. And this I'm speaking about here specifically is the Calypso tent. So as societies have changed over time, you would have had, and the Calypso audience itself is an aging audience. So we have to also consider that. And what we have noted is that over time, fewer and fewer persons have been going to the face-to-face events. because of age, because of concerns about, safety at night, etc. With the opening up of the online platform, what we notice is that those persons are now fully engaged. They are on from beginning to end. They comment. I spoke about the fire emojis earlier. They are engaged in that. They are learning as well. Another win is learning cyberspace, how to navigate that online interface and show your appreciation. Professor Boyce Davies mentioned earlier the whole issue of shouting kaiso when you are in person. They get to type these words. But what we also note is that it is a twofold win. The persons who are within the space, that is the nationals of Tobago and Trinidad, they then become more engaged in Calypso. So when we had the face-to-face, sometimes they would miss it. Sometimes they would miss a season, which is every year. Now they are tuned in and they are now re-immersing themselves in Calypso culture. And then the second one, of course, is our nationals abroad, who filled with nostalgia, filled with this yearning for their local culture, because they also, when the borders were closed, they couldn't come down. They couldn't travel. And so they too have had now an expansion of their knowledge base and their interest, because what this online platform actually allowed us to do is to share more, is to have more performers, to have more performers and to have more music being presented. Because if we really look at it, in the post-carnival season, usually you would just have carnival winners, as I indicated, performing. Now you have parang music, Trini parang music, but Trini Christmas music in March. So that really, adds to an expansion of persons' parang vocabulary. Then you have Steelpan music. Now you have the opportunity for many individual Steelpan musicians to perform and get an audience. They would have had to compete with a steel band itself for that kind of visibility in the post-carnival period. And so you have all of these wins just emerging. So this is why, even though I started off the presentation talking about, the challenges that COVID-19 presented, both for international economies and the international music industries, what we realize is that it opened, by my use of this case study, we recognize that it opened up, COVID-19 opened up new vistas and possibilities for engagement with music public. Thank you.
Okay.
I have a question, if I can ask another one. So as like the next generation of scholar writers and so on, following the work of people like Carolyn Cooper and others on orality, one of the questions I was fascinated with, since you were representing TUCO, which is a very male-dominated organization, how did they respond to you, or did they love the fact that they had another generation and a woman? And then of course you have a whole generation of women Calypsonians coming forward as well, and being able to have a presence. Maybe can you talk a little bit about women in Calypso and your own place in that organization? And I know we lost a major icon, Brother Resistance, recently, who was the head of TUCO and who really supported your work. And when I was in Trinidad, actually had me do some work with them as well, in talking about, that rhapsody tradition and so on. So probably maybe a little bit how that links with global issues as far as it relates to marketing internationally as well, and who is the face of all of that, perhaps?
All right, so thank you for that question. Yes, indeed, we did lose Brother Resistance, aka otherwise known as Utalo Masimba, and he was the president of TUCO, the Trinidad Unified Calypsonians organization. And as we speak about gender issues in Calypso, we also need to speak about the reach in terms of women who are not performers in Calypso. One of the things that Brother Resistance was very focused on was in having young faces represent Calypso, because of course I spoke about the aging nature of the art form in terms of the audience participation in particular, but also in terms of the fact that Calypso seems to attract persons who are over the age of 40. And so there needed to be a engineering of how do we get Calypso to the younger persons in the population. As part of my remit, as the Education and Research Director, as I indicated, I go to the secondary schools, I go to the primary schools, and we actually have a junior Calypso competition, which also allows for younger persons in the society every year to be part of this competition to sing their song. So that's one of the ways in which we ensure that the youth are involved in Calypso. But in terms of looking at women in Calypso, Brother Resistance was really adamant that because I have done so much research on Calypso prior to joining TUCO, he felt that it was necessary that I become the face of education and training, and of course the research element as well. Of course, I am a woman, and what became important was to engage. He saw it as an opportunity to engage young girls who may have been timid, because Calypso tends to be a male-dominated art form. You see that younger boys immediately get someone to lead them, someone to be their role model. And what Brother Resistance conceptualized in having me or in placing me in this role was that I could be one of those beacons to lead young women. One, to consider Calypso, to consider the engagement in music education, to consider the engagement in music scholarship, but also in terms of being that face to lead the organization into the next era. And that becomes important to note. We have, even though we've been saying that Calypso tends to be a male-dominated art form, we have had the good fortune to have many stellar contributions from female performers. I would have mentioned in my presentation about singing Sandra, who recently passed, and she had a singular contribution in terms of the way in which she delivered, the topics that she dealt with, issues between males and females, issues in terms of domestic violence, in terms of sexual harassment. So those are some of the themes that we see emerging out of the music when the female or the woman is involved in the presentation of lyrics for Calypso music. But we also have some young ones coming up. We have Karina Shea and, Megan Simon and Tiny, and one of the things I want to note is the use of the sobriquet in the Calypso art form. And so you may hear me speaking about these names, and sometimes you have a different persona that you put on when you are crafting and demonstrating your lyrics. And we see that what happens with a lot of the female performers is that they demonstrate issues of womanhood, issues of femininity, issues of gender justice. And those tend to be some of the main themes that emerge in terms of the female contribution to the Calypso art form.
May I ask another one of my questions? I'm still very interested with this intra-regional dynamics, historically and the contemporary world. And I wonder how different musical genres interact or communicate or have a conversation. I'm thinking of the Zouk in Guadeloupe, and recently, particularly the Kassav. And let me say publicly here today, Carol, Professor Boyce Davis, you always remind me of Jocelyn Beroa in the group Kassav. So I wonder, for instance, the recent sad passing of Jacob Devarieux, how it was felt in the musical communities and the population in general.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. Of course, when someone passes, it is always a sad occasion. When we look at the diasporic links in terms of the similarities between the music, I would have mentioned earlier, we believe in TUCO that Calypso is mother music. And we are thinking about that and getting those sorts of elements from our understanding of African tradition and where the music emanates from. And so that becomes important. And so we see that there are many other types of mother music that exist coming from that African root. And so when an individual dies who was seminal in terms of their performance and their contribution to mother music, there's a connection that takes place across the region. And of course, from Africa to the Caribbean region and all of the other diasporic spaces where these kinds of musics were celebrated. One of the important things, if I can juxtapose the sad passing, as you mentioned, of that individual who was in the Zouk, that band, when we look at Brother Resistance, who Professor Boyce Davies just mentioned, he was part of the Rapso tradition in Trinidad and Tobago, and he was actually the Rapso king. What is Rapso? Rapso is this music that comes from Calypso, which is mother music. So this is a derivative of Calypso music, where you add that rap element, and then we think about African American rap music, and we think about the contribution of hip hop music, and we see all of those connections taking place. So Rapso was this merging between, so it's kind of like talking Calypso, but with a rap beat. So you had that merging taking place. And it becomes important to see how we have those elements being existent within that space. What is this space? Trinidad and Tobago festival space. So we don't only have Calypso music, we have rap music. I would have referenced chutney music. I would have referenced chutney soca music. There's so many other sorts of traditions. You have parang, you have parang soca, and all of these elements, which is coming from the Latin American or the Spanish Caribbean tradition. So you see, and there are times when you listen to music coming out of Trinidad and Tobago, you realize that there's a merging of all of these elements, meaning that you hear elements of all of the Spanish tradition, the French tradition, sometimes the Dutch tradition, because part of what I do as well is I would go to the Dutch Caribbean, Curacao, Aruba, and St. Martin in particular, where there is a definite strong Calypso culture. And I've had the fortune to actually judge Calypso and Soca competitions there. And that is another space, in addition to the Costa Rica and the Panama and the London and the New York and the Miami, where you have Calypso being cemented in the culture. And of course, there's the African tradition to accompany it, and as well, Carnival. So the links are existent and numerous.
Okay, thank you. You answered my other question. It was about rap, Calypso, and so, yeah.
I have a small question. Yeah?
Yes?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much for this very, very enriching presentation to us. I know that message has always been very central to the practice. And given what happened last year with the COVID and all that, I'm just curious, are there new songs satirizing both the lockdown, COVID itself, government reaction to it, people's reactions to it? Because from what I know, those things never escape the pen and voice and head of Calypsonians. So I'm just curious, what's up with that?
Thank you very much for that question. Yes, of course. So we would have had a 2021 Carnival season. But what did that really mean? Again, Carnival was in cyberspace. And what we had is the introduction of the Carnival tent and the Calypso tent, as I mentioned, in 2020. We followed that up in 2021. And you had many songs treating with the COVID-19, the pandemic, the coronavirus. One in particular I can speak to is a song by Calypsonian Crazy. Remember I mentioned about sobriquets earlier. And Calypsonian Crazy, though his name suggests that he's crazy, he dresses in a crazy manner, but his lyrics tend to be very potent. And one of the things that he was speaking about is creating this awareness of what is COVID-19? Is it speaking about Armageddon? Is it speaking about something? Is it foretelling of what took place in terms of Bible stories or stories about the end of the world? And that is an interesting approach to looking at COVID-19. Of course, we would have had other examples of Calypsonians singing songs about COVID-19, taking elements about, protocols the sanitizing and etc., preparing yourself. Other persons would have spoken about what it has done to family life. In particular, there would have been satirical songs speaking about the relationships between men and women and how they treat with COVID-19 in terms of extramarital affairs that would have been taking place before, because those are also issues that Calypsonians speak about. One of the things we say in Tuco, and it is a well-known fact in Trinidad and Tobago, by Calypso, our stories are told. And so this is what we use the Calypso art form to do, to talk about what are topical and pertinent issues taking place in our society at the time. And as I mentioned earlier, also in our region and in the international space. So those would have been some of the issues that would have been dealt with by Calypsonians in terms of COVID-19. What we think might actually happen, because as we look towards 2022, we don't think that we're going to have a physical carnival in Trinidad and Tobago. So we expect that in 2023, as we still will be dealing with the ramifications of COVID-19, that there will be songs that will actually speak to different aspects of the pandemic. What do I mean? I'm talking about pro-vax, anti-vax, and the implications of vaccinations in terms of dealing with persons of color, and how there has been hesitation and apprehension in terms of treating with COVID-19 in a different way. And so, there's so many topics that can emerge out of. So I've just spoken about the preliminary topics, yes, but then it can be taken to such an extent that it's endless, it's borderless.
Thank you.
Welcome.
And could I pick up on that last line, the idea of what can be taken out of it? We've focused mainly on Trinidad as a place, but I don't know, I'm thinking of the Caribbean as a space is writ large in the cultural imaginary at this point in light of what's going on with Haiti and the lamentable policies unfolding at the state level. But I'm wondering about the dispersals of this art within the Trinidadian diaspora. Like, are there ways in which it spills out, or how does it spill out into other celebrations or forms that have a larger impact?
Okay, so what we have happening is, of course, COVID-19, we recognize global impact. Within the Caribbean space, there have been many responses to COVID-19 and how it has been rolled out. One of the things we would have looked at is the way in which, let's say, Prime Minister Mia Mottley would have dealt with it in Barbados, and how Andrew Holness would have dealt with it in Jamaica. And we juxtapose that to what's happening in terms of Prime Minister Rowley in Trinidad and Tobago. And so those are some of the elements that we would have been interrogating. And when I say we, I'm talking about the Trinbago Unified Calypsonians organization. As we speak to Calypsonians who are talking about, okay, it's now September. This is usually the time that you're going into the studio to get your material together for the upcoming carnival season. And so we have been having those kinds of discussions about what's been happening across the Caribbean, at least in particular in the English-speaking Caribbean. And those are some of the elements of the discussion. We are also thinking about staging joint Calypso competitions across the region, online, of course. Competitions for persons in primary school or below the ages of 12. Then you have that teenage competitions. And so we are in conversation with other like institutions in those other islands to see in what way that we could enlarge and broaden the reach in terms of discussion about COVID-19 perhaps, but more importantly about enriching the culture. One of the things that has been important to us, and I know that many cultures say this, that we are resilient people. But one of the things that we have had the fortune to have in the Caribbean is music and culture to act as a sort of salve in terms of dealing with issues. And this is why we are conceiving this type of opportunity to speak to different cultures in different ways. So even though Calypso might not be a dominant art form, let's say in Barbados or Jamaica, we can have talent competitions with separate genres to engage young people, to engage national public. So those are some of the activities that we are engaged in. One of the things that I want to mention, October is Calypso History Month. So for the month of October, TUCO spends morning, noon, and night sharing information with the general public about the Calypso art form. We use it as a tool to educate and edify. All right. Now, of course, COVID-19 is still very present, and Trinidad is not as open as some of the places in the United States and in the rest of the world. So what we have planning is to engage persons in terms of public lectures online. And we are also going to be having competitions as well for young people within this space. Professor Boyce Davies would have mentioned earlier in her introduction about the work that I do, is that I will be having activities on television to engage, because we know that not everybody is into cyberspace. Some people want to literally see, use traditional media in terms of television, radio, and print, to engage with the art form. So I'm going to be doing a series of shows on the radio, as well as going on several television stations to engage the public, to let them know about what exactly we will be rolling out for Calypso History Month. This year in particular, our theme is the bell rings. And so what we're dealing with in terms of focusing on Brother Resistance, who recently passed, who was the president of TUCO. And so what we're going to be doing is that we're going to be focusing on his work. We're going to be using it as a tool to educate on the contribution, because too often what happens is that you may know about the persons who you hear every year performing, but you may not have a grasp for what came before. So we're using this as a tool to dig into the history, understand the intersections between Calypso and Ragga and other forms of music and how they came to be. And so that is part of the rollout that is going to be involved in Calypso History Month. We also invite persons from other spaces. When I say other spaces, I mean regional spaces and international spaces, London, Canada, other parts of the Caribbean and Latin America, to share with us their activities, and we bill it as part of our celebration of Calypso History Month. So when we're presenting Calypso History Month, we're showing Calypso History Month from a global perspective, not only from a local perspective. So that's also what we're engaged in as an organization.
Wow. Okay.
Thanks so much.
Professor Richardson, how are we winding down?
It seems like it. So are there any more questions at this point?
So you mentioned briefly this hybrid model of exploring Caribbean culture. And I'm almost curious of the cultural creations of artists in these live streams, these posters in response to COVID-19 and the volcanic eruptions. I was wondering if you think this will shape not just histories to come, but also this is a form of documentation. Do you think this is also essential for I think new generation of scholars exploring this? How do you think this will impact future generations?
Thank you for that question. We have realized that there are several ways in which people learn and people engage with literature, people engage with scholarship, and people engage with new information. And so this is why we have a wide-ranging appeal in terms of how we engage our publics. I definitely agree with you that this is going to be a new way in terms of the hybrid model, in terms of how and when we engage with publics. Because we know that younger populations, younger generations are more interested in Instagram and TikTok and that kind of interface, as opposed to, let's say, looking at a show, a concert being aired on television. And so those are some of the ways. So for example, TUCO has an Instagram page where we engage that audience, because I would have actually been involved in undertaking research to look at how do we dissect our various publics. because Calypso is, our intention is to be loved by all, but we have different Calypso publics. And so we have to know how to reach them in order to engage them, because too often, and unfortunately, we hear talk of Calypso music dying or coming to death because the population is aging with it, because it is a music that came up with the whole issue of, decolonization and independence, etc. And what we recognize is we have to broaden and widen. So there are many ways in which we have conceived how we're going to be interacting with the Calypso art form and with individuals. Thank you for that question.
Okay. Professor Richardson, we are listening to you when you tell us to move to the next level.
Okay, are there any more questions at this point? Okay, Professor Asialamamba.
Okay, thank you. Professor Taiwo, a few words before.
Just to thank Dr. Sylvester for a very, very enriching. And I'm glad that, as I said at the beginning, this is not standard fare in these parts. So this is a very significant intervention. And I hope that people get enough to want to go look more into all this, especially the various divisions, and the relationship between what we call the modern music and the derivative musics, that come from there. Because sometimes people don't realize the complexities, the many performances and cultural forms that come from places that they think are quote unquote small. I think of Trinidad and Tobago in that sense. I think of Jamaica in that sense. I think of Cape Verde in that sense. And I think what you have done for us today is actually to sort of give us a very, very small slice of a very, very big dish. I want to thank you for that, and I want to wish you well, in this project as you continue to do them. And I want to thank, all the questioners and the participants and everybody. It's always great when you come hang out with us. As I said at the beginning, I hope that you have, we have made good use of your time. Thank you. So, Professor Lumumba.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Professor Boyce Davies and all of the others at Cornell. I really appreciate this opportunity.